Hi, everyone. So this is the first content-based lecture of the course. You see in front of you an infinity screen. That's just what things will look like before I go to my actual presentation. So don't let that worry you in any way. I also want to alert you to the structure of these lectures going forward. So on your screen now, besides my talking head, you'll see me open up an actual what's called a lecture guide for this course. These lecture guides will be in the Files tab of Canvas. They will also be linked to each of the different modules. So when you open up the module for the week, as you did this week, you'll find that lecture guide there. It's the way that I would suggest that you go about doing the assignments for the week is start by opening up the lecture guide, print that out or have it open on your laptop before you go through and do the readings, which I suggest you do first, particularly the text readings. Make sure that you do those first before going into the lecture, because I'm not going to go over every single thing that's in the textbook, partially because these textbooks are set up to deal with the semester system, and there's simply too much in each one of the chapters to deal with. And also, just thinking, in terms of economy, I will be going into what I think are the most important works of art and ideas in each of the chapters of the textbook, and oftentimes either simplifying the ideas or telling you the story in a slightly different way, or extending the ideas by adding information that isn't included in the textbook. So these lecture guides, as you see in front of you on the screen, and if you've printed this out, have the names of the works of art, the approximate dates. Remember, C in front of a date means circa, somewhere around that date. And BCE means before the Common Era, what we used to say, as BC or before Christ. It also has, if you look at this lecture guide, underneath, for instance, lion human, this early sculpture, some terminology that will be associated with that work and that oftentimes will turn up throughout the rest of the course. So again, start with the lecture guide, open that up or print that out as you go through the text reading in particular, and it will help guide you all the way through it. So with that being said, let's go on to the first lecture here, the first content-based lecture anyway, which is a lecture on prehistoric arts, primarily in Western Europe. So at this stage, the screen off to the right should have opened up to show you prehistoric arts with this little image from the cave at Lascaux, which we will come to later on today. So I suppose the first thing to be said is, and what you're looking at here is the first image that is referenced by your lecture guide, a reconstruction of a mammoth bone dwelling. This one is a mammoth bone dwelling that was in the area that is today known as Ukraine or parts of Russia. But you can find these types of dwellings or little remnants of these dwellings all throughout Western Europe. When we start with prehistoric arts, what we really mean about prehistoric is the age before written languages or symbolic languages. At least in Western Europe, these languages don't develop until well into about 2000 BCE in their own kind of symbolic form, or at least as far as we know, right? We haven't found anything. In parts of what is today the Middle East or Northern Africa, such as Egypt, we have cuneiform developing very, very early, 4000 BCE. We have the hieroglyphics certainly in place by at least 3000 BCE, but in Western Europe we don't have much information about the written languages early on. So prehistoric Western Europe is quite a bit different place than the Europe we think about today. First of all, as you will read in your readings, modern human beings, if we start thinking about kind of the evolution of human beings, go back a long time, right? We're talking about 3 million years, maybe more, for the first kind of, our hereditary ancestors. And certainly by 3 million years ago, we have what eventually develops into modern humans, the line of the Homo sapiens. But in Western Europe at this time, we're talking about basically the last, what we usually refer to as the Ice Age, or the glacial period in Western Europe, that extends about 150,000 years before our common day today, all the way up till about somewhere around 12,000 years before our common day. And in this area, then, we have lots of different animals that we wouldn't have had. We certainly don't have today. Many have gone extinct, including this. The woolly mammoth was around all over the globe, and will go extinct with the end of the last ice age. But this animal gave us a lot of material for early art forms, including our earliest dwellings that remain as an archaeological record, in ways that early, let's say, perishable dwellings such as wood or wattle and daub huts don't stick around in the same way. So I really just put this image in here to talk a little bit about what Western Europe looked like at this time, and to show you something that I think is super cool, right? A dwelling made out of these incredible bones that were then, of course, patched with hides and soil and so forth to make them fairly weather resistant. So the major, though, earliest art forms that we have these people, and again, what are these people like? Well, they're hunter-gatherer people. The development of agriculture hasn't occurred yet, certainly with these earliest of works. You're looking at on the screen right now what is referred to as the lion human, from the area of what is today modern Germany, which is made out of mammoth ivory, as a lot of these objects were, and they probably made these things out of wood as well, but that doesn't last as long, so we don't have records of those things. And this work was created somewhere between about 30,000 BCE up to 26,000 BCE. So just try to wrap your mind around those dates. It's a little over 12 inches high, and as with most objects created by prehistoric societies, most of the ways we make sense of these are by coordinating what we know about these early societies against a whole host of speculations based upon what we know about very kind of tribal societies today. So, for instance, while what appears to be a feline or lion-headed human, we don't know exactly what this is. What we can say is that these types of objects and the type of energy that would have gone into carving something like this certainly had some kind of importance to the group of people who created these. And if you think a little bit about the number of different religions that we know about that had part human, part animal forms, maybe the most famous being the Egyptian Sphinx, what are these things supposed to mean? Are they representations of some reality? Are they representations of beliefs? Are they, some type of symbolic form? Well, the standard understanding of these is that they're either one of two things. Either what we're looking at is a fairly accurate representation of some kind of religious class of priest, or shaman as they're often called in the prehistoric age, who is actually dancing with a decoration on his head in the shape of an animal form. And if that is the case, this isn't so different. You can just YouTube this to any number of traditional societies, whether these be the indigenous people of North America, the Native American or American Indian people putting on various costumes and dancing in the form of animals, or, as I've said before, groups in Africa today, groups in areas around New Guinea, who oftentimes will use their priestly class to affect the persona or avatar of a particular animal, maybe their spirit familiars, they're sometimes called, in order to gain access to what is known as the mystical or spiritual world, which is, it's in a sense, it's not so dissimilar than the way Christians think of heaven, but it's more extensive with this realm. Or another way to put this is, many traditional peoples believe that human beings share a common ancestry or some type of lineage with animals, that we are all one together. And one of the jobs of the shaman was to affect the persona of, in particular, powerful animals. And in this case, there's nothing more powerful in Western Europe at this point, and we see this all through Africa, than felines, these incredibly powerful prey, that the shaman might have affected some kind of transference into the animal spirit of. So that's one of the possible interpretations, that this is somehow an image of power associated with the shaman. Many times we call these classes of objects, which are related to this idea of animism, which is a term you come across in your textbook, the belief of the coextensivity of animal creatures with humankind, and a kind of power that can be gained through affecting a transference into the animal spirit. This idea of us all being connected. And well, these objects are often called fetishes, which came from early 18th century archaeologists talking about the way that particular objects have their own power. And again, this is a term that gets applied to a lot of traditional societies' objects. In other words, in crafting these types of little sculptures, you were crafting an object that contained a particular power, and we don't know what this is today, that could then be utilized in the world. So the object has its own power. That's what a fetish is. Now this, as many people have pointed out, is not uncommon even today. If you have a good luck charm, right? Something that you think brings you some kind of good luck, that's not so dissimilar than the fetish, although I think probably these people took it a lot more seriously than we do today. The other possible interpretation of these objects is that they're not actual representations either of a priestly class representing themselves in a dancing kind of tradition or some ritual tradition wearing a feline mask, but are rather representations of deities or some kind of mythological figure in their lives. And again, because we have no historical written record of these people or their belief systems, we can only make that assertion based upon what we know about contemporary traditional societies that oftentimes represent as deities a part human, part animal creature. By the way, these are often called Chimeric figures, and again, the Sphinx of Egypt is perhaps the most famous. So here's another image of this animal creature, part feline, part human, we believe, and just gives you a different view of it. Last week, I made reference to this very, very famous early sculpture made out of limestone, originally called the Venus of Willendorf. Now, as you've seen in your reading, hopefully, this figure is no longer referred to so strictly as a Venus. Venus gives us kind of the wrong view of what this actually is in a way, or it certainly lends credence to one set of interpretations rather than another. But with that being the case, let me just tell you a little bit about what we know about this figure. And by the way, this is just the most famous of we're talking hundreds of these little figurines that exist all through Western Europe into the East even. So number one, it's created somewhere around 2400 BCE. It's made out of limestone. When we're looking at these slides, you'll forget the relative size of things, but this is a very small figure, a little over 4 inches or so. And it's been pretty precisely carved here, hasn't it? So let's start with the context again. What do we know about these people? Well, some of the earliest interpretations of these works of art were based upon the idea, and I think it's absolutely accurate, that these people would have wanted to ensure the fertility and fecundity of their world. Now, this starts perhaps with human beings wanting to ensure the production of healthy children at an age where infant mortality rates were obscenely high, right? It's a very difficult world, and your average lifespan is less than 20 years old. But also, you think about the human being trying to ensure his own productivity, his own fertility, extending symbolically into the realm of the things that human beings need to survive, in particular, foodstuffs. So oftentimes these types of fertility figurines in the early interpretations were felt to not only be meant as kind of good luck charms or fetishes to ensure the production of healthy children, but also in a way to ensure that the animals would be healthy, their prey, the humans' prey, that the crops, I guess I shouldn't say crops, the foodstuffs that people gathered at this age. And by the way, very soon after this, they'll start cultivating early grains as the earliest form of agriculture. But for instance, in kind of the Ice Age, making sure that certain grasses that had grains would continue to grow, that you would find the root vegetables that you would need to survive, that various berries, when they would show up, would be available. In other words, all things that needed fertility would be ensured by the production of little figurines that were meant to ensure this. So that's what we know about this culture, right? That's very important. And the reason that we correlate these types of images with them has to do with their visual form. So in this case, it doesn't take much for you to probably look at this and realize that certain things are being emphasized and other things don't seem to be all that important to whoever sculpted this. First, whatever is on this figure's head, and it's probably some kind of hat that's covering the face, suggests that the face or the individual likeness of a human being wasn't particularly important, which then would seem to rule out the idea that this is some type of portrait of, let's say, an important figure, an important person. What is emphasized, we can see here, is the figure's corpulence, both in the large pendulous breasts here, the very kind of large hips and abdomen, the fleshy thighs, and when I show you a figure of this from behind, you'll see that that extends to all sides of this figure. So the other things that are emphasized here are the navel and the vulva, the vagina region of this figure. The fact that the hands are placed over the breasts emphasizes those even more. And so if we think about what is being emphasized about the visual form of this little sculpture, all of these things correlate with the idea of fertility. The fertility of the breasts, being able to nourish a child, the fertility of in a way, the fecundity of the figure itself, who is very large, obviously is eaten very well during a time period where that is not ensured at all. I mean, many early interpretants correlated these types of fleshy figures with, for instance, Polynesian culture that, especially in its traditional manner, would emphasize the healthiness of the clan groups through the corpulence of a leader who represented the idea that everyone was eating well. And those are being shown here as well. The fact that we focus in on the vulvic region of the figure would suggest that this has something to do with birth, and that's why that is being emphasized as well. Some other things that are interesting about this figure are that we are able to tell that the rock form, the limestone rock form from which this came, already suggested a kind of figure. The areas that are carved away are minimally carved in relation to the rock form itself that looked a little bit like this to start with, believe it or not. And this suggests that, and we find this in a lot of sculptures that come out of stone, and you'll see this in the cave sculpture, or the cave paintings as well, where animals are created out of protuberances of the rock. This suggests that the people would see a stone and actually think in the stone something like, wow, this stone is very closely associated with the ideas that I want to represent and to have this work embody, which then suggests that, you know, there is a kind of, I don't want to use the term magic, but power in the universe that these people were trying to tap into when they were creating their figurines and their paintings themselves. The other thing about this is that the navel of this figure is not carved in at all, or it's only been slightly modified. It was part of the natural limestone itself, suggesting, again, that thing that all life forms have, the navel, or at least, you know, human and animal forms have, was found in the rock before it was ever cut into this type of shape. So I want to add a couple of other things to this as I kind of move around this figure a little bit from the side and to see it from the back. Some terminology. The first terminology maybe that you should be aware of, we'll be using a lot this quarter, is that when a sculpture is carved all the way around, all sides, so that it could be seen from all sides, we call this kind of very straightforwardly sculpture in the round. And when things stand up on their own, we can call those freestanding sculpture. This wasn't probably meant to stand up on its own. Sculptures that are carved into the surface of things, like a wall, are called relief sculptures. And those sculptures can be in high relief, meaning deeply carved, or low relief, meaning very lightly carved on the surface. This figure, you can see a little bit of it on the left comparison slide, was covered with red ochre, which is a naturally occurring mineral. It's a kind of trace mineral from iron oxide. That was one of the favorite kind of pigments used on a lot of cave paintings as well as sculptures. And almost always the kind of speculation is that red ochre was associated with blood, and so that fundamental life source of all things, and that was a powerful symbol to associate with these sculptures. The other thing to know, I suppose, going back to the context, is that much of the early kind of spiritual belief systems of people seems to be tied up in the general category of what we call earth religions. Religions that deified, for instance, the sun and the moon, and really respected the cycles of life in their birth and regeneration and death, that human beings were seen to be a kind of microcosm of, and that all of their rituals seem to be tied up in these ideas of at least paying tribute to, if not symbolically trying to manifest, the recurrent cyclicity of life to ensure fertility, for sure crops, ensure that the food store stuffs were around. Also tied to these early earth religions, and just about every early society that we'll be covering, is the importance of creating communities, either creating small little tribal units or what we now call clans of people, especially during tough times. In order to ensure survival in a very rough world, humans had to band together. They had to work together. And as you'll see in your textbook, the most recent interpretation of these early so-called fertility figurines is that they were, if not a gift, between different clan groups all through Western Europe, almost like a little passport or a little insignia that you shared common beliefs, or you shared a particular attitude, or you shared something that would create friendships between different clan groups throughout Western Europe. This is another of these early fertility figurines. This is the so-called Venus of Vestanacy from what is today the Czech Republic. It's roughly the same time period, maybe even a little earlier than the so-called Venus of Willendorf. And it's got a lot of the same qualities, doesn't it? It de-emphasizes the head, it emphasizes the breast and the hips and abdomen. It absolutely emphasizes the navel. It has a little bit less emphasis on the vulvic region, but it's still fairly emphasized here. The difference, though, with this work, not only in form, is its material. This is an early form of fired clay. And as you'll read in your readings, this came from an area that seemed to have been experimenting with the ways that you can fire and harden clay, which, by the way, if you've ever worked in ceramics, it's not as easy as it seems. If you're trying to create a non-hollow form, they oftentimes explode, and there are a lot of fragments of clearly unsuccessful experiments in the creation of these types of forms. But it also leads to this question, right? Carving limestone could take a while, not a horrible amount of time, but a while. What does it mean for a culture to have been, in their own way, almost mass producing little figurines? What would that have suggested these were used for? Are these something that is part of every household at this stage? And if so, what does that mean? Or if we find these, and we are probably going to in years to come, miles and miles away from where they were produced, what does that suggest about the theory of these being exchanged, or at least kind of held up when you would meet a new tribe or a new clan to say, listen, we come from a common heritage, we've gone through the initiation or kind of meeting process between the tribes, and I'm not a threat to you. If anything, I am helpful to you. So there's a couple of these, right? They're prolific, and here's a form of what is known as relief sculpture. Right, in this case, you're looking at the so-called Venus of La Selle. La Selle is in a region in France, and by the way, this was on the wall of a larger structure that was probably associated with birthing, although, again, that's a lot of speculation. What we have here is another one of these Venus forms, same kind of emphases, de-emphasizing the head, emphasizing the breasts and the corpulence of the body and the pubic region of this figure, a clear indication to the navel. The hand is resting on the abdomen, pointing towards the navel as well, suggesting this idea of fertility. And then in her hand, she is holding a boar's tusk. And again, we don't know what this meant. In many early religions, tusks or horns are associated with the male counterpoint to female fertility, usually known as virility. And we'll see this as we go forward in this class, but it may mean that here, and it may not. It may be a drinking vessel. It may be a religious object. We just don't know about this. Again, this is a relief sculpture, so in this case the limestone has been carved away to show the figure, but it still remains attached to its back here. And that's what you find in a lot of, obviously, architectural sculptures. This one is a little bit later in date, about 20,000 to 18,000 BCE. And then perhaps one of the most famous of all these fertility figurines that comes from a place known as Çatalhöyük, which is in contemporary Turkey, one of the earliest really complex settlements, and you can read about this in your textbook. This figure is just usually known as a female fertility figurine from about 6,000 BCE, made out of, again, a fired clay, or what's known as sometimes as terracotta. I'm going to show you a kind of reconstruction of this figure here for a minute. This is what it looked like for a while when the museum industry used to find it like better to exhibit works of art with reconstructed heads on them so that people could see what they look like. And we've turned away from that these days. You'll oftentimes see kind of sculptural recreations of the original that reconstruct them, but we don't reconstruct the original. But what we have here, as far as we can tell, is again another fairly corpulent woman during a time period where corpulence couldn't have been particularly common, associated perhaps with birthing. If you look between her knees there's some suggestion that even a child is there, or some kind of smaller form. The emphasis again on the breast and the abdomen and the big hips and so forth. But in addition to that, what we note is that she's sitting in a chair, and this chair is quite a chair, right? It's what today we might call a throne. And in all parts of the Western Europe, all the way through Africa, even today, chairs are symbolic of usually leaders or people in positions of importance. And here, this is certainly the case because this chair has on it, again, feline forms. And these feline forms, whether they be leopards, as the text suggests, or something else, are symbols of power. These are very, very powerful predators, and in this case, they are associated with this, this probably leader, and leader, by leader I mean maybe it's a political leader, like the head of a clan. By the way, you should know in early Earth religions, women were oftentimes very important leaders for the societies, at least in as much as we can figure out, and partially because their bodies mimicked those cycles of nature that were so important. So here we have this leader who could be political, but she could also be a spiritual leader, or maybe she's, the leader who, in one way or another, ensures or is the priestess in charge of fertility, or is a kind of early form of midwife, or something symbolic of the idea of birthing, protected by these two major felines. And then I just wanted to, again, show you a couple more of these. This is a so-called standing woman from Greece. These things happen all across Western Europe into parts of Africa, and they're very, very similar to one another. So again, what we can say in summary about these is that they seem to have something to do with fertility or ensuring the fecundity of the world in which these people lived, that they probably functioned in some way as charms or amulets or fetishes imbued with their own powers to ensure these things, that perhaps they were used as forms of almost like passports or emblems to show other clans that you or your leader had been in contact with their leader, and that you were a friend rather than a foe, that you shared similar common beliefs with other people. And by the way, you should be aware, although not put in textbooks so often, that there are male equivalents of these types of female fertility figurines all throughout Western Europe. This is a phallic pendant, probably worn as a kind of necklace. You can maybe see the two holes up around the head of the penis form. It's a phallic form here. That would have been tied to hold it around the neck of a figure. Again, maybe it's the male equivalent, the idea of virility or male power. Maybe it's something else. We're just never going to know for sure. Again, this is carved out of mammoth bone, which was one of the most enduring ivories at the time. Then we have these other objects. There are far fewer of them, but they make you wonder what they are, because they don't share the same attributes as those fertility figurines. This is the female head from Brassenpoy, which is an area in France, from roughly the same time period as the Venus of Willendorf. And in this case, what we have is an actual head, lacking the eyes here, but a really careful articulation of a head. Maybe it's in an abstract form, yes. It doesn't look like a likeness of anyone, as your text points out. Many archaeologists call these memory images, like if you were going to draw or sculpt a head from your own memory, what are the things that stand out most? But on the other hand, it doesn't emphasize any of the things that the other fertility figurines emphasize. So what is it? Is it a particular leader? Is it artistry just per se? Maybe it had no real function. It was just meant to be a beautiful object. Was it meant to represent one's ancestor or a deity? Is it possible, as many archaeologists have speculated, that originally the face was painted to have the features that it's lacking? In other words, painting on eyes, painting on a mouth. We know that all these early figurines were painted. Again, most of this is open to speculation. Just a couple of anecdotes here. What you see is hair, maybe hair plating, meaning braiding of the hair, or it may be these very characteristic woven hats that people at the time wore. to keep their heads warm, right? It was not a particularly nice climate at this point in Western Europe. This is that figure from the back then. So some of the most interesting finds from the prehistoric period are these cave paintings that pay particular attention to these, and go back over the reading if the ideas didn't make sense. I've included on your lecture guide a map of all the areas in which cave paintings have been found throughout Western Europe, all the way into the east, and into parts of modern-day Turkey as well. Most of the most famous cave paintings, and the ones that we'll be looking at in this lecture and in your book, are clustered around the area of northern Spain, Altamira in particular, and the area of the Dordogne in France, so through the kind of southern to central region of contemporary France. All of these were, I think, all the ones in France and Spain, found by accident. You know, the original finding of Lascaux, which is the most famous of the caves, was found by a kid kind of playing and falling into a hole, and then kind of exploring this cave and finding all these extraordinary paintings in there. So again, the timeline of these are, and you're looking at here just a horse, actually two horses. You see the hind quarters of the horse off to the left, and the full horse's flank and his head a little bit above that, from the cave of Pecamero. It's the oldest of the caves found, as old as, maybe 25,000 BCE or even more. New forms of dating has suggested some of the caves go all the way back to 40,000 BCE, which is just extraordinary. Now, the thing about these caves to know right off, because it's a common misconception, is these weren't the dwelling places for these people. They didn't live in these caves. In fact, most of the cave paintings occur fairly deep, far away from the entrance to the caves themselves, which suggests a kind of symbolic or religious or spiritual purpose to the paintings themselves. In other words, they were protected and only probably visible to particular people, or maybe even groups of people during particular times when they would be initiated, or some kind of ritual was probably occurring. The other thing to know about these that the text goes about showing you right off is that the way that they're created is kind of cool. They're primarily created out of earth pigments. The blacks that you see here are primarily charcoal. We know that fire was harnessed early on, so we know how to create charcoal here. But the charcoal was mixed with spit, saliva, and water, and held in the artist, whoever these so-called artists were. They probably weren't the way, it's not the artists that we would think of today. Whoever the creators of these were, it would be held in their mouth and either spit out directly, using the hand primarily as a mask, right? So that if you want to create a firm line, you put your hand really close to that rock and you spit right along that line. Or by using a tube like a straw to get a little bit finer line. And then some areas that are needing a little bit more detail would be applied with fingers, like all those dots that you see here. In addition to that, and we don't know what this is, like if this was meant to be a marker of the individual artist, or if these things were meant to be something else, and I'll come back to this in a bit. You see that hand mark right above the horse right here? These are all over the caves, everywhere to be found. And again, what were these meant to be? Well, let's go into some of the specifics of this. Number one, while these are abstractions of animals, meaning simplifications of their form, they are very, very accurate in their own way, in their own simple way. Like originally, people thought, well, they're just trying to decorate a horse by putting spots on it. But now we've figured out through finding, remnants of these animals that there were spotted horses all throughout Western Europe. That the images on the walls range when it comes to what's being represented, from horses to bison to various felines to woolly mammoths to kind of all different types of forms of animals. And only some of these animals are associated with the prey of the humans that created these cave paintings. So let's look at a couple of these. This is the so-called Hall of the Bulls in the most famous of all the caves, which up until 1960 you could visit, but because this is Lascaux, I should have said that, Lascaux Cave in the south of France. You used to be able to visit until the 60s, and then, and they're immaculately preserved from 15,000 BCE or so. But with all the visitors who wanted to see these, the opening up of the caves to the elements, to frankly people breathing in here, started to deteriorate the images. And so these have all been closed off, and only archaeologists and art historians can see these, whereas an entire perfect replica of the caves has been created so that people can visit that kind of virtual cave in Lascaux. The Hall of the Bulls, which you see here, is named this because of all the bison that you see on the walls. Again, these are all created by using naturally occurring pigments, charcoal and red ochre, and blowing these pigments through the mouth onto the walls themselves, and fairly accurate representations of animals. Now I say fairly accurate because all of these cave paintings, or the vast majority of them, use what's known as a composite perspective or a composite pose to the animals. A composite pose means that you might show the animal's head full frontal. You might even see two eyes, or you see the flank from the side at the same time, or you see the hooves pointing straight forward towards you. In other words, it shows you the animal from multiple perspectives all combined into one. This is very common as a form of representing both animal and human forms. We'll see it again when we get to Egypt, as a way of giving you the maximum amount of information about the animal or human meant to be represented in these places. Now, you will hear, this is a kind of schematic of Lascaux to show you how extensive these caves are and how many different animals are on there. You see here what's called the rotunda, a big open space, the axial gallery, which has a long kind of chamber, the Hall of the Bulls up there, and what's called the nave, and then the so-called chamber of felines way over to the left-hand side that's got some feline forms as well as other forms, stags and bison and horses and so forth. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. What the heck are these? Why would these people have made these? Well, we tend not to believe that they only made these just because humans have a penchant for making images, right? That these were a form of art, kind of the earliest form of, let's say, mural painting. We believe that they had some other function, as most did. Now, the earliest interpretations of these cave paintings, starting in the 1800s and really getting going around the 1900s, and I don't mean about these specifically because we knew about other kind of rock paintings as well before these were discovered in the early 20th century. Was that these early interpretations suggested that cave paintings were meant as a form of sympathetic magic. This was one of the most common interpretations. And what these interpretants, early archaeologists, anthropologists, and art historians thought was that people would depict the animals that they wanted to hunt for their food, and then either throw spears at them or depict them, for instance, sleeping to ensure that they might come across these big animals in a more vulnerable position, and that by giving them image as such, you could control them a little bit. We don't really believe this anymore. There are spear marks on the wall that suggest people did throw spears at these, but we don't think it was a form of sympathetic magic because many of the animal forms, frankly, the majority that you're seeing, weren't the animals hunted by these people. So that leads to some question. Another early interpretation that still sticks around quite a bit today is that these images were part of ceremonies, just like those fertility figurines, to ensure the continued fertility of the earth. In other words, you would represent animals, and oftentimes animals around mating season. You'll read in the text, for instance, that those early interpretations of animals lying down, suggesting that you would ensure that you'd come across them sleeping, are probably more likely animals basically lying down during mating season, doing what's known as dust wallowing, kind of both covering themselves with dust or dirt, as well as rutting and all of the hormones that are released there. So those would be associated again with the idea of animals mating and reproducing and ensuring that there would be animals out there, probably not so much for hunting, although some of these, the deer and stag, were hunted, but rather just to ensure the continued reproduction of the earth of the time. Another early interpretation, and this one sticks around today as well, is that these sites were somehow tied to the strengthening of clan bonds, either within a particular clan or between various clans, and were associated with various initiation rites. One of the more contemporary interpretations of these types of cave paintings is that they were meant to be a form of teaching young hunters different animal types and different animal habits, and showing them what they looked like and where they could be most vulnerable and brought down. And perhaps the most contemporary interpretation of these kind of combines them all together and suggests that these areas were used for shamanistic practices, in which the shamans or the artists themselves, who could have been shamans, would go to these caves that would be associated with kind of the womb of the earth, as early caves oftentimes were thought of, kind of the deep recesses of the earth from which all life came. This is a part of a lot of later religions, that the belief that humans and animals were fashioned by some deity out of clay or out of dirt, or brought forth from caves. And that these shamans would look at the walls, and this is common in these areas as well, find shapes. There are protuberances in the walls and even textures in the walls that have clearly been adapted or transformed by the paintings themselves into really realistic paintings of these animals. And in the process, they would be kind of contributing to the fertility of the clan, of the tribes, of perhaps these were deified animals themselves, and ensuring fertility and fecundity in the universe itself. In these contemporary interpretations, people suggest that hallucinogens, which we know some of these people absolutely experimented with, primarily things like mushrooms, could have been ingested as part of the initiation process of bringing other shamans into the group, or in ensuring these or continuing these rites. I'm just going to show you briefly a few more of these images. This is the so-called Chinese horse here that you see a little bit off-center to the left, next to a giant bison, a stag with many antlers over to the right-hand side, another horse way off to the left. This is where the early sympathetic magic ideas came from. You see this horse, which seems to be pierced by arrows, right? So these forms right here, perhaps arrows or spears are more likely at this time, as we'll see. Then some other kind of symbolic form over here, which people have suggested is an early form of riding, but we're not sure, and maybe a spear even here in the hindquarters of this horse. But as I've said before, excavations of the dwelling sites of these people don't suggest that, for instance, these early European horses were a major food source for the people. So we're not sure what that means. A bison here. And in this case, you can see the way that, maybe you can see the way that the actual protuberance of the rock juts out in this area here in order to show a distended abdomen that may be a representation of an animal that is pregnant. Head, very accurate representation, right? They're trying to represent these things as accurately as they can. And then maybe one of the most interesting of all of these paintings in Lascaux, anyway, it's totally unlike everything else. So, you know, be aware of this. This is idiosyncratic for the rest of the cave paintings, which have all of these layered animals, one on top of another on top of another. In this case, we see a bison who is, it appears to be right next to this figure here of what looks like a human figure with maybe a bird head. And if that's true, if it has a bird head here and it's meant to be a humanoid form, it's most likely a shamanistic form or some kind of deity, god, that is being represented, early kind of simple spiritual figure, next to a spear thrower. You see this here, I'll show you a couple of examples of this. In order to maximize the distance and force of spears, they had these spear throwers that are basically an extension, the kind of rod in which the spear sat that you could really get a lot of leverage on throwing the spear from. That is nowhere near his hand, but you see that it appears that over here on the bison, a spear has gone through this figure and disemboweled him in some way. These would be the, you know, the guts or the intestines pouring out of this figure, who looks a little bit let's say, woeful about what is going on to him. But perhaps he has killed this figure, you know, the humanoid figure, as the figure has killed him. And then off to this side, you see a woolly rhinoceros. Yes, woolly rhinoceros actually roamed this area during this time period, kind of running the other way. We don't know what this is. The text offers a couple of suggestions that this is about, again, a shamanistic ritual, maybe a ritual having to do with life and death, or you know, fitting oneself into the animal spirit of this bird-like form. Bird-like forms are oftentimes adapted for shamans as a form of kind of flight or hovering above all things, of getting into the spiritual realm beyond the material realm of everyday life. A little bit of a close-up of this. Remember, these things are at least 15,000 years old, if not more. So I just showed you a spear thrower, so I thought I'd show you this as well. This is a so-called spear thrower with ibexes. Ibexes are, they're still around today. They're kind of like a giant gazelle or something, a deer form, from about, and this is carved out of, again, mammoth ivory, from about 12,000 BCE. Part of it has been broken off, but it's clearly a kind of luxury item, an item that probably not everyone owned. It's not your simple kind of spear throwing device. Its functionality, in a sense, has been sacrificed a little for this decorative quality of adding the ibexes, which then makes you wonder, was this a part of another ceremony? Maybe ceremonies or rites that were held within these caves, used not in order to kill an animal, but maybe to show others, you know, the right way to, or the most productive way to bring down game, or who knows? Really, we don't. And this is another one of these very decorative spear throwers or atlatls. So again, just showing you the major areas in France and in Spain that had the cave paintings. So we've been here first. We were over in Pecmerel, right here. Then we went to Lascaux here in the Dordogne region, and now we're going over here to Altamira in Spain, just briefly. And I wanted to show you what these look like in relation to a human, what the size of these things are. Altamira is the youngest of the caves, from about 1200 or so BCE, and you see the same thing, same types of animals, same type of application of pigmentation to the surface of these caves, same type of use of the contours and protuberances in the caves to emphasize the volumes of the animal figures themselves, and it gives you a little bit of idea of scale here as well. So it's really just one more example of these things. Now you see bears, and you see something that looks like an ape or a monkey in here all over the walls. Now we know these people didn't hunt the bear, they were afraid of the bear, but or we suspect they were afraid of the bear, who wouldn't be? And you see lion-like forms perhaps. So again, if these weren't meant to be a kind of sympathetic magic or a teaching device for hunting, perhaps they were associated with rituals in which people tried to basically channel the inner power of the very powerful predators they saw in the world around them for their own usage. And this leads to another interpretation. I haven't shown you a lot of these, but you see them in the textbook, those handprints that are everywhere. Most recently, within the last 20 years, someone has suggested that those are the marks of the uninitiated putting their hands on the walls and having a shaman or themselves blowing the imprint of their hand onto the wall as a way of contacting the rock and trying to enter the rock, as shamans were thought to, in order to make use of all this kind of spiritual power that was imbued in the rocks by the representation of these animal forms on the exterior. Let me go at this another way. If this interpretation that one of the things that these shamans are doing, or these artists who we call shamans were doing, was finding in the rock the spirit that animates all kind of life and seeking out the powers that are associated with these very, very powerful predators. And if we believe further that these shamans felt like they could enter into that kind of source of power, actually kind of become one with the rocks, which may or may not have had to do with imbibing hallucinogens, then only the initiated, only these special shamans could do it. And perhaps a way of bringing others in contact, maybe it's clan leaders, maybe it's different people from different clans into proximity to this power, was to have the shaman enter, bring the uninitiated in here, and have them put their hands on the rock, and through a ceremony kind of paint their hands on the rock, so to speak, or blow around their hands with these pigments so as to leave their imprint of their hand on the rock, so that they too could experience this kind of, what do you say, kind of coming into contact with the powers of these big predators. Just a couple more of these forms. I have visited Altamira, but I have not seen Lascaux or its virtual copy. And one of the things that you can't get from these slides is what it feels like to be surrounded by all these images, and how many of these images are everywhere to be found. They're just everywhere, one on top of another on top of another. Some kind of ape or monkey form, perhaps. Maybe this is an elephant form, a woolly mammoth. Protuberances of the rock being used to show you the volumes of, in this case, a kind of upside down bison, another bison. And then of course it's not just cave paintings that we've found around Western Europe. This is the so-called Bison Sculpture in one of these caves that is carved out of the naturally occurring clay that is next to this, or within this cave. And again, in this case, originally, the interpretation was you are actually representing, and these are very high relief carvings, right? They don't exist in 3D completely. That you were carving these animals in a state of repose or sleeping so that you could supposedly, extend this hope, this wish, sympathetic magic onto the beasts themselves and come across them sleeping so that you could kill them more easily and eat them. What people believe now is that these are bison that are in the middle of their rut. They're dust wallowing, and they're getting ready to breed to ensure the perpetuation of these beasts throughout the world. So I want to move over now, and I'm not covering everything that's within your textbook chapter 1, but I do want to cover a couple of the most kind of interesting, they're both associated with life and death, and they're both associated with ritual. They're not both necessarily tombs. This one, though, is largely a tomb. This is Newgrange in Ireland. It was created roughly the same time period as the first manifestation of Stonehenge, which is, not too far away, also on the British Isles. So around 3200 to 2500 BCE. And it is a giant tomb structure. It's what's known as a passage grave. Passage graves are long corridors in which one dead or numerous dead are placed, and they're very common. They're an extension of the earliest types of tombs, which are known as dolmen. Dolmen are two upright stones onto which a third stone is placed, and the dead are buried in there, and then it's all covered over. These are that, but imagine numerous dolmen, or this kind of wall plus ceiling space being created. In this case, this giant tomb form, and I'll show you some details of this in a moment, extends such that the opening here, the corridor here, goes straight down into an area that is a giant, almost dome, known as a Corbelled Vault, and I'll show you the way that those are created in a minute. They're some of the earliest tomb forms. So let's talk about the symbolic nature of these early tombs. Number one, at Newgrange, what we know is that tombs are and burial rituals are maybe the most important aspect of creating clan ties to other people, and the kind of fundamental starting point for all early religions, right? People grappling with what life is and what death is and what occurs when one dies, and these are the way religions really get started. So in this case, this giant form was probably originally dedicated and created for the death of major leaders, maybe of multiple different clans, bringing them together in one place. The opening that you see here, especially on the top, is aligned very closely with the winter solstice, and that's important. Winter solstice is, of course, the shortest day of the year, and it would have been associated with death then, right? The shortest day of the year when things are very dark, and if you've never been to Ireland before, during the shortest day of the year, it's even bleaker than Seattle or, the Pacific Northwest, if you can believe it. And so the sun would be lined up out here in our space and go into that area to create a light shaft that I'll show you in the middle, as if to think about or to symbolically manifest the idea of death leading to rebirth or life. And I bring that up here because you see on this rock in front of you the incision of these spiral forms. The spiral form is almost pan-cultural. We find it all throughout the world, and it usually is associated with life and death, the cycles of nature, right? Things are born, things live their life, things die and give rise to new life forms. It's if you've ever seen The Lion King, it's the whole circle of life thing, and they're a very prominent form throughout the world, and we see them here as well. So they're one of these stones they're limestones that have been sized with these forms. So a really, really low relief sculpture in a way. Here's that opening again. Again, this is a basic dolmen form, right? It's what's known as post and lintel architecture. Two lintels or upright members that are crossed, are two upright members known as posts that are crossed by a horizontal member known as a lintel. When you get these three together, they're known as a dolmen. When they're in giant form, they're known as trilithons, but we'll come to that in a moment when we get to Stonehenge. So this is what it looks like. If you were to look at it from what's known as a cross section, you see the long here passage grave with upright members. These almost look like tombstones, right? And then you get to this area that looks almost like a dome. It's a Corbelled vaulted area in which one believes various rituals would have taken place in here. The midwinter sunrise would pass directly into this area and illuminate the deepest recesses of the tomb itself. This is the way that you create a Corbelled vault, just so you know how this works. They're kind of the earliest form of dome structures. It's just created by overlapping different stones on top of one another and then putting what's known as a capstone at the top in order to push down on this material and keep it all in place. And then in most early tomb forms, in order to really hold this together, you need some weight on top of it. They would cover the whole thing in earth to protect it. This is looking from the deepest recesses of the tomb out towards the midsummer sunrise. And this is the interior of Newgrange in Ireland. Again, you'll note here that those spiral forms are everywhere to be found. We're looking at the deepest area, the Corbelled vaulted area here. You see all these, when you just see one stone upright, it's known as a menhir or a stelae. When they're crossed over, they're known as dolman here. These are, again, associated with, as we do today, tombstones, right? And in the central area, although we don't know what it would have occurred, it's not the case that in a structure such as this, you just create a tomb and you just leave it and close it and bury a dead person. Instead, numerous bodies were probably placed here. They've since been moved, and rituals would have occurred, and we believe that these rituals would have brought together, as one of the interpretations of Stonehenge has it, many different groups of people in order to ensure clan bonds between them. This is looking up into the Corbelled Vault of Newgrange. And finally, for today, probably one of the most famous, although maybe not the most important, but one of the most famous architectural structures, if we can even call that it's kind of a ritual structure that has inspired a million different interpretations about it. This is Stonehenge, of course, and you're seeing an aerial view of it. So from up above, in the state that it is in now, it's an incredibly complex area. There are many of these types of structures throughout the British Isles, and by that I mean what is known as a cromlech. This is again a term that's on your lecture guide. A cromlech is a circular form of basically dolmens, or in other words, it's a bunch of upright stones that go around in a circle, and in this case are capped off by other stones. Basic post and lintel system. When you have these together and in a circular form, they're known as a cromlech. If you just have a singular form standing up, this originally would have had a cap on top of it. But this is something you find all throughout Western Europe and into the Middle East. When you just have a singular stone standing up, it's known as a menhir or a stelae. And of course, this form of construction in which you have a vertical member, a post capped by another horizontal member, a lintel. This is known as post and lintel architecture. So here's the thing. I'm just going to try to sketch this out for you because some of these terms are a part of your major reading assignment, your reserve reading for this week. And I'll get to that in further detail in a moment. This outer circle, and by the way, Stonehenge was created over and changed in its orientation over the course of at least 1,000 years. So it's first constructed somewhere and we're talking about this area out on the outside, these little holes that were dug and filled with chalk and with the remains of cremated bodies, were created as far back as 2700, 2750 BCE. And then this ditch was dug around the outside, right around that same time period. Probably originally this inner area, that Stonehenge proper, was created out of wood, but then somewhere along the way, and again the dates on this vary, but somewhere around 2000 BCE, these stones were brought in, these gigantic limestones, and this outer circle is what's known as the Sarsen Circle, created out of limestone blocks that are approximately, let me make sure I get this right, 26 tons each. We don't know how they did this, right? These are, the closest quarry is at least, 2 miles away from here. So moving these things would have been very difficult, but placing a stone on top of this using, what system we don't quite know, would have been extraordinary. And they're all, by the way, and I'll show you this later on, fitted together and very carefully carved so that they will hold together as a structure. Inside of this, and again, these things took different orientations at different times during Stonehenge's many modifications, or the so-called trilithons, and there are 3 of these, one that doesn't have a cap on it anymore, these gigantic forms. In this case, these trilithons are 24 feet tall, so almost twice as tall, not quite twice as tall as these on the outside. These are about 14 feet tall. And they range, I mean, we're just guesstimating that each one of these is about 50 tons, right? So to even get these things upright must have been incredibly hard. And then you probably see down here these smaller stones, but by smaller, I mean of the range of about 4 tons are the blue stones. And the blue stones were reconfigured a million different times here. But here's the curious thing about the blue stones. They're kind of volcanic stone. By the way, they don't all look blue. They come from a part of Wales that is about 150 miles away. And again, the question is, how the hell did they move these things at this time period? Interpretations range from using logs that are placed on the ground and greased, and you kind of roll these things over the logs and then take the back log and move it to the front and keep going. But if you've ever seen one of those really horrible archaeological remake stories about Stonehenge or the pyramids where modern time engineers try to do this, it never works, right? The logs just get pushed into the earth. It just would have been a crazy difficult process. Or putting them on skids, actually greasing up the ground. And this is what we did with early logging, for instance, in the Northwest, is lay down logs, grease them up, and basically use animals and humans to push and pull these stones over greased up logs, and then keep creating log forms and keep creating log forms. Or some of these could have been put on barges and moved in the various waterways, including the Avon River, which is very close to this, to move them close to this area to minimize the use of skids or log rolls or what have you. But again, it's the $1,000,000 question, how they ever moved these, and the same question will reappear when we talk about the pyramids themselves. So now, what is this area? What was it used for? What have been the different theories of this? I gave you a very long reading, and I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of that. It is the subject of your first writing assignment, and you'll find that prompt on Canvas, of course. That reading I chose for one major reason. It's longer than just about any other reserve reading that you'll have all quarters. Don't let it freak you out. Spend some time with it. The big reason is that reading has within it all of the major, at least partially kind of plausible interpretations of Stonehenge from the last 120 years or so. So you can read through that reading, and this author systematically will tell you about why people at a particular time believed that it was used for this, and what the criticisms of that interpretation have been with modern new discoveries or reinvestigations, and then he concludes with his own interpretation of what Stonehenge was used for, combining a couple of the more common theories. And this is still a fairly plausible interpretation of Stonehenge. So the things that I want to tell you about are, number one, so here's just a schematic of Stonehenge. You see the trilithons here and the blue stones that are around here and the Sarsen Circle that's around the outside. The bank with the little kind of holes that are dug in it. The ditch that runs around the exterior of it, and then the famous Keel Stone that originally was believed to be associated with one of the interpretations of this work as a gigantic solar charting system. This is a little bit more complex diagram of this. You can always pause these lectures or look at these images on their own so that you can get a better sense of how this whole thing is put together, right? But I thought you would be interested in this. I'm just going to bring this here for you. Again, the outer ditch, there are burrows all over the place, 2 within the structure itself, a number outside of the structure, and more in a kind of sister development that isn't on this site, off of this site, that is known as the Durrington Walls, and we'll come back to that in a moment. These burrows, by the way, hold numerous cremated bodies and partially cremated bodies, which leads to the more common contemporary interpretation that this is an area that's associated with either death or healing or both, and cementing clan ties between the 5 major clans that we know to have probably cropped up on the British Isles in this area of Wessex around this time period. So some images of Stonehenge. I think most people have seen this before, seen from the outside. And to give you an idea of the scale of the Sarsen Circle, again, these stones are about 14 feet or so tall and weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 26 tons each on average. You see the interior blue stones here. They're a slightly different stone, but still very heavy. Here's a reconstruction of what it looked like in its last manifestation. So you see the outside circle and then a kind of horseshoe shape of the trilithons on the inside. And then the blue stones arranged in a circle here, but also in a horseshoe form on the inside as well. Remember that these, and you'll find this in the reading, kept getting reconfigured through the various ages of Stonehenge. So when it comes to interpretations, there are plenty of them for Stonehenge. The earliest ones were the most fanciful, right? The earliest ones were early Brits believing that this was a structure that was created by Merlin, the magician of the so-called, Arthurian tales. Obviously, unless you, I love Merlin and Arthur and so forth, but probably not accurate. So don't put that on your test. It wasn't created by Merlin. The other major interpretation, which, it got the names wrong, but it's not far off, is that this was associated with ritual practices of the Druids, which were a Celtic priesthood. Now, it's not a Celtic site, so they're probably not Druids per se, but they're clearly associated with ritual practices. So whoever the priesthood was for this structure over the many years that it was in use, it is certainly associated with that ritual function. The other major interpretation, and that's why I've got this image up here, and it continues to today, is that the various axial alignments of the stones, the openings between the stones themselves, their orientation towards the Keel Stone, which you see up here, seem to suggest that at least parts of this, and at various stages in its various manifestations, Stonehenge was used to chart, or at least gain some kind of insight on the movement of the sun and when the sun would be at particular points in particular places. So you see here, for instance, that the midsummer sunrise happens in rough proximity to the Keel Stone. Now here's the problem. We've been able to chart this a lot more accurately today and realize that the Keel Stone is off, and it certainly would have been off if we think of this the way that the Earth was oriented towards the sun 25 to 3,000 years ago. It would have been off even more. So it's not perfect, but it is fairly closely aligned with these various celestial events that were important to the period of the time period, not only to predict things like the seasons, but also because most early religions are built around various cosmologies in which a celestial event is associated with a certain kind of symbolic importance for the people. Here's that Keel Stone, way on the outskirts of this, again roughly aligned with the midsummer sunrise here, but a little bit off. And again, that may be because this was moved at some point in time, or the Earth shifted. It's unclear. And here it is in the evening hours with the sun moving through these various areas and being axially aligned with various celestial events. Here's the construction method of this. It's a post and lintel system at its basis, but in case you were thinking this was just crudely thrown up, you're heavily mistaken. All of these blocks of stone were carefully carved so as to fit together in what's known as a mortise and tenon situation. A mortise is a kind of inset in the stone. And you see here the tenon, the thing that fits into that inset to hold it in place. And then you even have a little, protuberance over here to hold these things together. So very, very carefully constructed. It took a lot of work to make these things fit together. And then, again, how they ever got these things upright was some kind of early form of block and tackle maybe, or building up logs and setting these things on them and pushing them in place. It's, we don't know that. So then, what are the more common contemporary interpretations of this? Well, in a way, that's your task this week for your reading assignment and your writing assignment. You're going to be asked to do this very careful reading of a very long series of interpretations and their more contemporary criticisms of those interpretations, and finally this author's bringing together of a number of the most compelling points of the interpretations of Stonehenge to give you his own rationale for the functional usage of Stonehenge. But I'm not going to leave you completely on your own. I will help you with this. What we know is that Stonehenge probably had different functional usages at different points over the almost 2,000 years that it was in use by these people. We know that while it's not perfect, it seems to be aligned with these celestial events, and in particular with the sun. The sun is oftentimes in early spiritual traditions symbolic of life, but we know that this site was also a burial site. Many cremated bodies placed in various areas around Stonehenge. And so life and death and those cycles of life and death are certainly something that figure into the symbology of Stonehenge. The other major thing, though, that makes Stonehenge make sense is that this seems to have been the kind of symbolization of death that was used as a ritual site, whereas not far away from this, down the Avon River, was a site known as the Durrington Walls, which was very similar in its structure, but made out of wood with a giant circular shapes, multiple of these, by the way, dwelling areas, an area that probably not just the initiated would go to, or you wouldn't just go to for a ritual, but something else was occurring there very similar to what was happening at Stonehenge, but for a wider public. And you're going to read about this all in your reading, and you're going to establish a discussion about this, and in the end you're going to write a little summary reflective essay on this interpretation of Stonehenge, so I don't want to give it all away. Finally though, something that is not included in the interpretation that you have in the reading for this week is something that's fairly new. We've gone back through the barrows in particular, in which we have and by the way, these things were all excavated early on at a time when the person doing the excavating just realized that there were cremated bodies in here and didn't pay much attention to the stratification and lumped them all together. We've been able to go back through some of those evidentiary remains and realize that first, and this again is part of the interpretation, that the people who came to the site came from all over Western Europe. They did not just come from the British Isles. They were coming from as far away as area now known as the Ukraine and even parts of Russia. Why would they have made this pilgrimage to the site? What would that have been about? Think about that in relation to the interpretation. The other one, though, that we've figured out as well is that some of the remains of the people, and these are bone fragments and so forth, seem to suggest that people had come to this site who needed healing of one form or another, that they had been injured or that they were diseased in some way, and they may have pilgrimaged to the site much the same way that people pilgrimage to various sites today, one of the most famous being Lourdes in France, in order to get themselves healed. And this, at one point in its usage, might have been a pilgrimage site for people to come try to get healed. And then if they didn't, they would go through this ritual ceremony of cremation and so forth. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this very simple lecture on kind of the earliest prehistoric forms. Granted, if you're scratching your head and saying, wow, we don't know much about these early forms, that is the nature of this time period. We really don't know much about this. As we go forward in time and we have more historical records and more symbols being used by the people or the cultures that we'll be studying, we will know more and more, and you'll get more and more information about the specifics of these. Thank you, and I look forward to reading your discussion posts and your reflective essay papers.